Today on the Think Wildlife podcast, we talk about one of India's most charismatic large predators, the Asiatic wild dog, aka the dhole. Though the species is one of the most widespread large carnivores in South and Southeast Asia, it has often gone under the radar of the public and conservation efforts. Joining us on this episode are the members of the Dhole Project. Launched in 2016, the project aims to conduct research work on dholes to better understand the requirements and formulate science-based strategies to conserve the species. Join Arjun, Anshita, and Mayank as they talk about the conservation of this beautiful wild canid and narrate stories from the field. Also, the project is currently running a fundraiser till December, which will be utilized to support their research efforts. You can find the fundraiser in the description of the episode. Additionally, listeners of the Think Wildlife podcast can upgrade to an optional paid subscription on Substack or YouTube, where 30% of the revenue from this episode will be donated to the Dhole Project. No worries, the podcast will not be behind a paywall. So even if you decide not to upgrade, you can still listen to the podcast. Now, on to the episode. So, welcome, guys, to the podcast. It's a pleasure to have you on today to talk about dholes. So, why don't we just start with all three of you giving a brief introduction of yourselves?
Yeah. Hi, Anish, and hi to everyone listening. I'm Arjun Srivathsa. I'm a carnivore scientist and also an artist and a cartoonist. I work at the National Center for Biological Sciences in Bangalore, India, and I'm also affiliated with the Wildlife Conservation Society in India. I've been working on Asiatic wild dogs, also called dholes, for the past 14 years now. And the current project that I'm running is called the Dhole Project, which has like multiple sub-projects and stuff and very interesting stuff, which I hope to speak to you about. I have two members from my team and they'll introduce themselves.
Hi, my name is Mayank, and I work at NCBS Bangalore, and I'm part of the Kerala team where we are trying, our broad objective is to estimate the population of dholes in Kerala. So I'm part of that team.
Hello, everyone. I'm Anshita, and I work as a research associate at Wildlife Conservation Society India, where I get to work on Asiatic wild dogs in Valparai, and we're looking at various different aspects, which I'll get into later in the conversation.
What got each of you interested in the Asiatic wild dog?
I can answer that first, and I think that's also quite common with some of the other people in my team. I really love dogs, and I wanted to always have dogs in my life. And while I was studying my master's in wildlife biology and conservation, I happened to chance upon this fascinating species. And then it was around the same time that I also saw them while on foot inside a forest for the very first time. And those two things put together, I think, got me interested in working on those.
So for me, it was not dholes love at first sight. I mean, I like forests, and earlier I used to work on birds, but then I saw this opportunity, and I mean, it was a opportunity to work in the forests of Kerala where I had not worked. So I grabbed it, but I have been with this project since last 2 years, and over time, yes, I mean, I am now in love with the dholes.
So I'm interested in working on carnivores, and when I started out exploring this field, this opportunity came to work with Arjun in 2019. And at that time, I don't think I knew what those were at all. And so the fact that I did not know anything about them, it was quite mysterious and nice, and it got me interested into those since then. Yeah.
What is the current conservation status and global distribution of dholes? Where can one best see them in the wild in India?
The IUCN, which makes red lists and status assessments for various species and categorizes based species based on how threatened they are, places the dhole under the endangered category, which is which basically translates to the fact that there are not that many left. How many dholes are left in the world, we actually don't know the real number. Based on expert guesstimates, there might be somewhere between 4,000 to 10,000 dholes around the world. And if we look at adult mature individuals, it's about maybe 1,000 to 2,000 of them. Dholes are found mostly in forested habitats in the forests of South, Central, and Southeast Asia, largely in South and Southeast Asia. And yeah, that's as much as we know in terms of the globally. India does have the highest population of dholes. And within India, it's one of the 3 carnivore species that is categorized as endangered by the IUCN. The other 2 species being the red panda and the tiger, of course.
So let's move a bit towards the ecology and the behavior of dholes. So dholes are known as one of the most successful hunters of the Indian forest. What makes them so successful as hunters, while other carnivores like tigers and leopards have a far lesser success rate in a hunting success rate?
Yeah, so a couple of things perhaps. One is that they're social animals. Those live in groups called packs. Packs usually have between 2 to 25 individuals. Most packs are actually average at around maybe 7 to 8 individuals, I guess. But the fact that they live and hunt in packs makes them a lot more efficient. A lot of what we know of the kill success rate of dholes actually comes from studies of their close cousins, the African wild dogs. So we don't really know for sure what the success rate of dholes versus tigers or leopards is. And also, I guess one other aspect of it, I mean, this part of it is informed speculation, is that they hunt during the daytime. They're also able to corner their prey much better. And they, unlike the tigers and leopards, which both the cats essentially follow an ambush hunt sort of a strategy, wherein they have to hide and get really close to the prey. And then with following a short chase, they'll be able to catch their prey. Those, as opposed to that, are sort of coursing hunters. They run, chase, and follow their prey, and that seems to work better for them. They're also able to coordinate with other pack members, surround the prey, and sort of strategize much better. There's more of them. So that, I guess, makes them much more successful. But we don't really have the numbers to say how much more successful they are in terms of kill rates.
Be persistent. So I feel like they just tire out their prey. By the end of it, the prey just gives up.
That's true as well.
And given that the dholes are such successful hunters, their range largely overlaps with tigers and leopards. So how exactly do dholes coexist with these 2 large carnivores? And can you also talk about your work on intra-dial interactions between these 3 large carnivores?
Yeah. So the simple statement based on this is that they are basically cats and dogs. They don't really get along with each other. They don't really like each other. They will fight like cats and dogs do. But for a very long time, and even now, there's a lot of misconception about in a competition between tigers, leopards, and those who really wins. There is a notion that forests that have a lot of dholes, perhaps tigers don't survive there. And to sort of counter all of these things, a few years ago, we started to look deeper into what exactly is the dynamics between tigers, leopards, and dholes. Like you mentioned correctly, in terms of their diet, yeah, they do overlap quite a bit. They all feed on pretty much the same types of wild ungulate herbivore like deer and gore and wild pigs and so on. But the other problem is also that a lot of these carnivores are also confined into forest habitats that are getting increasingly isolated, which means that we're squeezing them in space. And when that happens, they need to figure out how to deal with each other while also making sure that each of them survives. So a lot of our work starting back in 2016, 17 onwards and up until now, what we have realized both through ground-based studies as well as conducting systematic reviews and meta-analyses is that in terms of a dominance hierarchy, tigers are pretty much on the top. Second in the hierarchy are the dholes, and then bottom of the list, unfortunately, are the leopards. But at a population level, if you look at any one wildlife reserve or a protected area, if you have adequate prey numbers, it seems like all of these three species will somehow adjust with each other and manage to live. They do so by either avoiding each other in space or avoiding each other in time, or both sometimes. There's also a lot of fine scale avoidance, that one will run away when it sees a competitor and so on. But a lot of it comes down to how good the prey base of that location is. If we have adequate prey, all of them will manage to coexist with each other without too much competition, directly at least, and without decimating the other's population. But as the prey numbers go down, the competition between amongst these three species will actually increase. And that is when we will likely start seeing that one or more of the subordinate carnivores will start getting weeded out of the population.
Let's move on a bit towards the conservation of the dholes in India.
Mhm.
How severe is the threat of free-ranging dogs on dholes?
We've been floating the idea that free-ranging dogs, stray dogs, domestic dogs, mostly unowned dogs, as a potential threat to dholes. Some of our work currently, as well as for a very long time now, has been to try and see if we can quantify this in some sense. We do know from our work in Kerala, in central India, and Western Ghats, and so on, that there is spatial avoidance. Dholes and domestic dogs don't really share space as much, but that doesn't mean that there is no interaction. They do run into each other frequently. We know this both based on direct evidence, indirect science surveys, as well as from talking to local residents in all of these places in peri-urban areas, rural areas, in agroforest plantations, and so on. We know that there is some sort of a competition between them, as in one will dominate and chase the other away. But since domestic dogs are known to be carriers of several diseases, there are chances that when they do interact, either directly or indirectly, there might be disease transfer happening. And we know very little about the disease ecology of many species in India. And of course, dhole is one of them. And on the other hand, dogs can also be an indirect threat, in that they might compete for the same wild prey in areas where they enter into wild habitats. In that the domestic dogs and stray dogs will chase after wild ungulate prey animals like deer and wild pigs. And indirectly, by taking away the prey that belongs to the wild dogs, that belongs to the dholes, they create indirect competition as well. But the true nature of how much of a threat they are, we still don't really know. Is Mayank, do you want to add something?
Yeah, so since dholes are social animals and they live in packs, so somehow they are more susceptible, because even if a single dhole is like comes in contact with a dog which carries disease, and then the dhole gets that disease, it is very simple, and like easily it can transfer it to the entire pack, and like that can have like very negative effects in the overall dhole population.
Unlike human tiger and human elephant conflict, we don't really hear much about human dhole conflict. Is it a problem? And if so, how severe is it?
This is a question that requires a little bit more nuance, because conflict is a very broad term. Conflict in the sense that you are referring to it can either happen, like very broadly speaking, in two ways. One is that the wild animal is directly affecting the life of the person, in that there are cases where, if hypothetically, if a carnivore kills a person or like attacks the person, then the second thing is damages caused by the animal to property or like domestic livestock. Then there is a third level wherein the conflict is not really happening, but people perceive that there is, because of fear of the animal, there are opportunity costs and so on. So I will not go into this part of the forest because I know that there are leopards there. There may not be leopards there, and so on. Those might be happening. And the fact that I am not being able to do something that I want to do because of the fear of the carnivore, that is costing me something as well. So there is that level of conflict as well. And there is also other like behavioral and other social aspects as well, which I'll not get into. But in the broadest sense, the human dhole conflict you're referring to, I presume, would relate to either those attacking people or those attacking and consuming livestock. With the former, I in all my years of experience and looking through literature over the decades, there has been pretty much no evidence of dholes attacking or with the intent of eating people. And I think I might be wrong about the exact date of this, but I think that is the only record that exists is from 1940 or 1941, where somewhere in the Western Ghats there is a British hunter record of two dholes attacking a person. Chances are that they might have had rabies, and when dogs get rabies, when dholes get rabies, they lose fear of people, they lose fear, and then that might have happened. But that's speculation, of course. But other than that, there has been no real instance where dholes have attacked people. When it comes to livestock, is when we need a little bit more detail or digging in. For some reason, I'm not really sure why. There are some potential explanations, but by and large, for some reason, in central and south India, where dholes are found in really large numbers, they do not really attack livestock. Predominantly their prey consists of wild prey animals, wild ungulates. Very small proportion of that is livestock, and therefore most people in these areas do not perceive them as conflict species. Southeast Asia has very few dholes and also very low numbers of ungulates and pretty much no forest grazing livestock at all. So even in those locations, we do not hear much of the conflict. The peculiar case is actually in parts of Northeast India, in Bhutan and Nepal, wherein the mountain-dwelling dholes are perceived as conflict animals. And these are also the locations where they consume a lot of domestic livestock. And the reason why they're also actively perceived as a conflict species is because the livestock plays a much different socio-economic role in these societies than it does in Central and South India. So a lot of these things to contribute towards why those are treated as high conflict species in the northeastern region.
So this question is for Arjun specifically. You had produced a paper which examined human-wild canid interactions using socio-ecological framework. What is this paper about? Could you elaborate upon it?
Yeah, so this was a collaborative project that I was part of, led by Dr. Mahi Puri. So we worked in central India, and then one of the aspects when we worked on multiple carnivores, and one subset of the carnivores happened to be wild dogs and wild canids and hyenas. As part of that, we looked at how dholes were using forested areas in the Kanha-Pench corridor forests, which are largely unprotected forests and also multi-use areas, which means that a lot of people use these areas to move around, collect fuel wood, graze their cattle, and so on. What we found was that dholes were not really using these areas outside the protected area a lot. Very few areas had dholes. The interesting thing that we also found was that, which added to our empirical knowledge about human-dhole interactions, was that people did not really view dholes or most of the other wild canids and hyenas as really problematic, even though species like the wolf and the jackal did take a lot of their livestock. They did not really perceive a threat from these animals. A lot of their anger and frustration was directed towards the big cats and sloths. So that was one part of it. And this is also a study where we examined what role the free-ranging dogs, domestic stray dogs play in that landscape. And there too, we found that the areas frequented by dholes and those areas that had a lot of domestic dog activity were quite starkly separated in space, which means that there was some indication that they were avoiding each other.
What are some of the other threats faced by dholes in India?
Apart from the threats that we have already discussed, like dogs and livestock, so one of the major threat is habitat degradation or fragmentation and habitat change. So currently we are doing like a small study only for Kerala, where we are seeing like what are the factors or anthropogenic factors which are, in a way affecting the dhole populations. So there we have seen like human infrastructure such as railways, roads, human settlements are in a way affecting the dholes negatively. So this is one of the major threat to dholes. Apart from that, like we discussed, dogs in terms of disease. then there can be persecution due to, perception or hatred towards the animal. Yeah, these are some of the threats currently in India.
Into that, the presence of dump sites around everywhere now. A lot of animals, not just carnivores, but all other animals also have started depending on these dump sites in some or the other way to scavenge for food. And we think those might also do the same. And so which brings them in very close contact to dogs, again relating back to disease like Mayank has already mentioned.
So let's talk about the Dhole Project. What is the idea behind the Dhole Project and what is the long-term vision of this initiative?
I started the Dhole Project in 2016 and I was a PhD student at that time. And the idea was to have a larger project that tries to understand this species better beyond my individual PhD. Of course, the initial years just focused on me completing the question, sort of addressing the questions that I had asked during my doctoral work. And then eventually it expanded, of course. The reason the project was conceived at the time was that I knew that this is the species that I wanted to work on in the long term. And it was an endangered species and a very severely understudied species. And I had a sort of a vague 10-year plan wherein I wanted to contribute as much scientific knowledge towards the conservation science related to the species to figure out what exactly is happening to their populations, packs, metapopulations, and so on, and ask scientific questions that can help address the conservation needs of the species. And that's how the Dhole Project started. I don't know if I can confidently answer if there is a broad long-term vision for the project now. On the surface, it all looks like we have this great project going on, and it is a great project. But then on every monthly and yearly basis, we are basically like reevaluating.
Yeah, I think that's a common problem with most conservation projects is that it's a bit hard to plan for the long term. So this question for all three of you. What have been some of your most memorable moments?
So this was the first year of fieldwork of the Dhole Project, and
Yes, so I had an entire favorite week. So this happened this year itself in January 2024 when we were surveying in Parambikulam Tiger Reserve. And this entire week was so crazy because the entire team had so many sightings. We sighted dholes, we sighted leopards, including a melanistic leopard, and along with that, elephants, gores. And the week previous to that, we had a very few scats which we collect for our work. And this week was along with the sightings, we also got a lot of scats, and the entire team was so happy, and the food was good. So, yeah, that is my favorite week from the project.
So clearly from my team members, it's obvious that anytime that there's a lot of data that we get along with some good field sightings qualifies as a memorable time in the field. A lot of my memorable, I don't know, I can't call it memorable really, but in 2019, when I first started the fieldwork for this project, it was the exciting parts or the memorable parts were largely a good sighting of a dhole or an elephant running into one and so on. But as the project has sustained, like 2022 post-COVID onwards and until now, every time I'm in the field and something goes wrong, I feel like it's a memorable moment. Because one day something happens, it rains a lot and, we can't have our teams do the surveys. I just sit back and think, at least I have a team that is doing a survey. So that's a memorable event. One day, like a forest watcher doesn't turn up because there are other responsibilities and we are unable to walk a line. That's completely fine because the forest department is working with us. We are, managing to keep the project afloat. That's a memorable moment. So for me, a lot of the bright, shiny moments are the in-betweens, where like the project manages to sort of stay afloat and power through.
So are direct sightings of not only those but other large mammals like elephants and leopards common doing fieldwork? Because from my experience in central India, like having a sighting of any animal doing fieldwork was a big thing.
We can't say it's very common because we do go about 5 days, 6 days a week sometimes of not really seeing too many things in some parts of the forest, but that doesn't mean that that's the overall experience. We have not had an entire field season with no sightings or very few sightings. Even though we taken a lot of interns who come and work with us during the field work, and some of them have had the better sightings than the team members. But yeah, it's quite common. We run into elephants quite often, gores. We've had multiple tiger and leopard sightings, and those, of course. Pretty much in every site, in every field season, we have had good dhole sightings as well.
It must be quite scary to see a tiger or an elephant while on foot.
Tiger is not as scary. Tigers usually run away, but elephants, yeah, we have had some close calls, and this is also where the experience of our team members, some of us who have been working in these elephant filled forest landscapes for a long time in elephant country, basically, as well as the experience of the forest watchers and guards who walk with us. Those two come in handy quite a bit. We are able to sort of navigate these spaces carefully, cautiously, while also being very respectful of the animal spaces as well.
So in February 2021, the Dhole Project developed a genetic field and analytical method to estimate wild dhole populations. Could you guys elaborate upon this?
Yeah, so this was also the paper that Anshita was referring to, the data for whatever happened. Whatever was published in this paper came from the data that we had collected in 2019 in Wayanad. So in the beginning of this conversation, I had mentioned that we don't know how many dholes there are in the world. We are still sort of throwing around speculations and guesstimates. One of the purpose of me starting the Dhole project was to have a reliable way to count dholes. When you have species like tigers and leopards and jaguars and so on, we use camera traps to identify individuals because their pelage patterns are very unique. And using these photographs that camera traps take, we're able to at first get a minimum count of how many unique individuals there are. And then we apply statistical models. Do not have such unique pelage patterns. They all look very identical to each other. So you can't use these sort of camera traps directly to estimate dhole numbers. So we figured out that the answer actually lies in their poop. Their poop has their DNA. And if we go around walking in the forest, encountering tigers and elephants and so on, and sometimes dholes as well, we are not looking for dholes per se, we're looking for their poop. Their poop, their scats, they have their genetic material, their DNA. And when we chance upon it, we collect it. And once we bring it back to the lab, we try to identify how many unique individuals there are based on their DNA. So now once we have that information, it works similar to having photographs of a tiger or a leopard. You know how many unique individuals there are. And we use very similar statistical models to then estimate how many dholes there are. And that's what we did in 2019, the study that was published in 2021 eventually, to produce the world's first statistically reliable estimate of dhole populations. This was, of course, based in Wayanad in Kerala. And we found that there were about 50 odd dholes in the protected area, and at a density of about 14 per 100 square kilometers, which is a pretty high density for a large carnivore of that sort. So that paper was a milestone for myself, for the project, as well as for carnivore ecology, quite more broadly speaking.
Another project you guys worked upon was creating a strategic roadmap for dhole conservation using the spatial prioritizing approach. So what exactly is the spatial prioritizing method, and could you also elaborate upon the entire project about dholes?
So this one was a part of my PhD work. The idea was that can I take on a national level project that can eventually serve as a blueprint or a roadmap for a national dhole conservation plan in India. A spatial prioritization is a conservation science approach that looks at different spatial locations, different locations in space, and prioritizes locations based on what is more important for us to invest money in for conservation, what is of lower priority, and also counter that with how easy is it to implement conservation in one place versus the other. And based on all of these trade-offs and gains and losses, we figure out what are the locations where the money needs to be spent, what are the locations that are important but currently resources are not being spent, and what are those locations which that are redundant in that like any amount of investment of our resources is unlikely to yield any result. And that was another paper that was published in 2020, which was based on my PhD work. And at the end of it, we did come up with both priority ranks, if you can call it that, for different states in India, as well as going down to the taluk or the sub-district level. So we had an idea, we now have an idea about what sub-districts should we focus on increasing dhole habitat, which is forest habitat. What are the locations where we need to focus on increasing dhole populations? Which are the states that are doing well in terms of dhole conservations? Which are the states that need to do better? And which are the states in India that, irrespective of what they try, it's not going to contribute to overall dhole conservation in the country. This does not mean that any state should be discouraged from contributing towards it, but there is a priority list, and some states investing even a little bit more resources will take dhole conservation a long way compared to some other states. And that is what an assessment like spatial prioritization allows us to do.
Earlier in the conversation, we had briefly spoken about the work you guys are doing in Valparai. Could you also elaborate a bit more about the research you guys are doing on dholes in the agroforests of this landscape?
Yeah, so Anshita will speak a little bit about that.
So, like you said, Valparai is a very unique landscape. It's mostly agroforests dominated by tea. There are some coffee estates and smaller other agroforest estates. And it's also surrounded by protected areas on all sides. So we try to look at the space use of dholes in Valparai, which is outside protected areas. And we have also looked at dholes using scat collection and hair analysis from the scats. And surprisingly, we also found some poultry in their diet. So we thought, okay, since there haven't been any recorded instances of dholes hunting or feeding on poultry, so where does this come from? So we are still exploring possibly that the dholes are depending on dump sites, or like we're still exploring that. And we are also looking at the microhabitat associations of dholes. So we have specific locations where dholes were present. And we're trying to analyze if there's something at a micro scale that affects why they are using such locations in a agroforest landscape. And few of my colleagues have also worked on behavior of dholes in Valparai as well as vocalizations.
Yeah, no, so and also, Anish, like you mentioned, Valparai is very unique in multiple aspects. One is that, of course, it's a agroforest, like tea-dominated area and all of that, but it's also a very good natural laboratory, if you can call it that. You have not just dholes, but many other large mammal species like elephants and gores and sambars and so on that live alongside a very high population of people. These are tribal people, they are tea plantation workers, and also other local residents. And there is, of course, like some instances of conflict, but then by and large, it's also some sort of a model for how coexistence is possible in shared spaces, and also how this might be the way forward, considering most of our protected areas are very small, isolated, and becoming more and more insular. And wildlife numbers have come up thanks to all of our laws and protection efforts in the past 50 years, which means that the wildlife population will continue to increase or at least stay stable. And these animals are going to use these sort of spaces that are secondary habitats, not native forest, but some sort of in-between habitats that allow them space, refuge, and food, and so on. And the fact that a large carnivore like the dhole can exist alongside people in such a landscape was quite fascinating for us. So along with all of the individual projects that Anshita spoke about, our idea was to also get a broader sense of how humans or dholes interact in these areas. What kind of a role does the dhole play in their folklore, in their religion, and so on. So we're exploring that as well. We were very interested to understand their behavior and vocalizations and so on. And it's also a location where we are trying our best to increase our outreach and engagement with local residents, including school children, where we have conducted outreach activities, created dhole cartoon themed merchandise and comic books and so on. And we've engaged with the students as well. So that's one of our, like I call it my natural laboratory. It's a very unique and interesting place to understand how to envision a future where dholes can coexist with humans in shared spaces.
Beyond the Dhole Project, what has been done to conserve dholes not only in India but across its range?
Yeah, so I've been working closely with the IUCN Dhole Working Group for the past few years now. I'm fairly privy to all of the other work that's been happening in most of the other dhole range countries. So far, we have some work that's been happening as part of the All India Tiger estimation work, the sort of surveys that happen in India once in 4 years. So which the Forest Department and the Wildlife Institute of India take charge on. So that has yielded a lot of country level insights on dholes. There is also a project in central India that WII, Wildlife Institute of India, has been leading in central India, Maharashtra, and also in Madhya Pradesh. There have been some attempts to revive a dhole-focused projects in Bhutan, but most of that work happens as a byproduct of tiger work. Nepal has a few researchers now who are very interested in dholes, and they've been doing some good preliminary work on the species. And other than that, I guess Thailand is another very interesting place where for a while now, for about maybe a little over a decade, there have been some projects going on, including some telemetry collaring work and so on. So this is by and large what I can think of as major projects. There are also smaller projects happening in some of the other Southeast Asian countries like Indonesia and so on. But I foresee that the next couple of years we'll see a lot more projects in Southeast Asia that will focus on the dhole.
I think there's also one project being run by Oxford's Wild Crew on, I think, dholes in Malaysia, if I'm not mistaken, or Myanmar. I'm not exactly sure. That's the only other project I'm aware of.
Some of these things also sort of piggyback on each other, and I'm not saying it in a negative way, and it's great. Wild Crew has had a good presence in Southeast Asia, with the focus being the clouded leopard. And since there is a lot of camera trapping going on, focused on the clouded leopard, any information that comes along with the dhole, I mean, with reference to the dhole as part of those projects, is of course contributing to dhole research as well.
And my final question is, what have been some challenges you guys have faced at the Dhole Project, and how are some ways individuals can contribute to it?
So I think a basic challenge that we do face is funds. And, we have a lot of ideas, but we may not always have the resources or the right funds to approach it, even for outreach and communication. Funds are really important. And since those are non-charismatic and very less studied, these are the very few initial studies on those that's happening right now. And it would probably take a few years to build case for those to acquire a level of funding that it needs.
Yeah, so apart from the funding, so for our work, we rely a lot upon the interns. So basically, in every field site, we will get like 4 to 5 interns who are just out of their bachelor's or master's. So we have to train them. And the challenges are also fun. So, we get to learn a lot, like how to train and how to, deal with these people, not in a bad way. But then we also have to sometimes go to remote locations where there is no phone connectivity or anything. And then if I have to report something to Bangalore about the progress of the project there, then, you take your phone and hold it on your hand up, and then roam around to find the network. So, people place their phones in different orientations just to get the network. So it's really funny in that way. One more important thing is like we engage with a lot of stakeholders while we are doing our surveys, which include the forest department, the local people, tea estate people. So any kind of communication with these people is challenging sometimes, but with all the experience we gain from this project, somehow we manage to navigate through these challenges, and it always ends up in an opportunity to learn something new.
Yeah, so I like I mentioned in response to an earlier question as well, a lot of the challenges seem like very formidable challenges in the beginning when the first time it comes along. But then once we have dealt with it and it comes along again, we don't really treat it as a challenge the second time round. It becomes something that we have learned how to deal with. So in that sense, we've managed so far to convert every challenge into an opportunity, or at least a learning opportunity, if nothing else. But like what Anshita said, and I also mentioned before, funds are always going to be an issue. And I don't think this is a problem just limited to us. Conservation science is difficult. And also a lot of the time to do really good work to present some really path-breaking thing in the field of wildlife ecology, it takes a couple of years to be able to produce that kind of data and analysis to yield good results. And if the projects or institutions or sometimes even the forest department is interested in only very short-term 6-month project or a 1-year thing and to show immediate results, that becomes a challenge as well. So that's hard to navigate, but I guess that's something that we need to deal with. If somebody wants to contribute towards the Dhole project, there are multiple ways to do it. At the very basic level, follow us on Instagram. We are at the Dhole Project on Instagram. We post all of our field updates over there. Second thing is that if you are a resident in India, please apply to come and intern with us. We take on interns pretty much every month of the year, including when we are working in Bangalore during the monsoon months. We don't do any field work during the monsoons. But definitely during the field work time, like between October to May, we take in between 3 to 5 interns every season. And we've been doing this consistently since 2019. Then the other thing also, if you can't do any of these things, is to, like, if you can afford it, then donate to our project. You can find the donation links on our Instagram page as well.
So I will be adding the links to the Dhole project in the description of the podcast below, and I'll also be putting the email ID of the Dhole project so that people can contact you directly for either supporting you guys or asking more questions. But yes, thank you so much for taking time out for this, and it is a pleasure to learn about dholes.
Of course, yeah. Thank you so much for this opportunity. I'm glad I could do this with my teammates.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Anish.
We have reached the end of this episode of the Think Wildlife podcast. If you are still listening, thank you, and I hope you enjoyed this podcast and learned something new about conservation. Feel free to leave your thoughts on the episode and don't forget to share and subscribe. Before we end the podcast, I would like to share another podcast on Indian wildlife called The Thing About Wildlife by Ishika Ramakrishna. Also, for those who would like to learn more about conservation in India, I have attached a link to 3 books on Indian wildlife, which I highly recommend. One is a field guide to the mammals of India by Vivek Menon, which is by far one of the most detailed field guides I have seen from anywhere in the world. The second is titled At the Feet of Living Things, written by the various conservationists at the Nature Conservation Foundation. It covers 25 years of the organization's research, ranging from the conservation of snow leopards in Spiti Valley to rainforest restoration in Annamalai and dugong conservation in the Andaman and Nicobar Islands. The final is a 4-part series by Mr. H.S. Pabla, a former Indian Forest Service officer, which provides a very in-depth analysis of the state of India's conservation and the way forward. It covers species reintroduction, wildlife tourism, the forest rights, and poaching. He also talks about his time as an officer heading various conservation projects in Madhya Pradesh, ranging from the reintroduction of Barasinga and blackbuck to the gore and tackling the Panna poaching crisis. And with that, we end this episode of Think Wildlife Podcast. Thank you once again.